Hey guys, it's your boy Bit Brother, aka as Drubale Vect. I'm here to show you some of the tips and tricks that I've got for setting up nice renders in Blender for your 3D models. I'm not going to say it's a tutorial; it's more of a collection of things that I do. So first thing I want to make sure is you're using the newest version of Blender, because there are a lot of things that they've done to the rendering engine, specifically cycles, to add denoising, especially if you've got an RTX card that's RTX accelerated, and they've done a lot to add to that engine. So the first thing I want to do is make sure we're using it properly. So make sure you go to Preferences. You want to go to System, and in Cycles Render Devices, make sure that you've got it set from None to CUDA, and then select your video card and your processor. In here you can also change the number of undo steps you've got. I think by default it was 32, I could be wrong, so you can change that there as well. With the newest version of Blender it auto saves, but you can also just save just to make sure. I usually do. While we're here, I would suggest one plugin that we'll get to here in a bit: Images as Planes. That's a very handy one, and I will show you one use case for it here in a bit. So now that we've got our preferences set up, let's make sure that the world scene is set up correctly. So if you go here to the render properties, make sure that you've got your render engine set to cycles. Blender has 3 rendering engines. Eevee, which is a real-time rendering engine. Eevee also has some problems which we'll get into when it comes to lighting. Workbench, which is technically what the viewport is. This is the workbench renderer by default, so I'm not really sure why that is one of the rendering engines you can create stuff for. So once your render engine is set, you can also change it from the instructions for rendering to supported, or the new stuff, which is experimental, which I haven't had any issues with it. It still runs fine. There's no real issues with lighting glitches that I have seen. There could be cases that I'm not aware of, though. And then you can also set what device you're rendering with. So if you've got a video card, I would highly suggest using a video card. If you're running integrated graphics or an older video card, you can still use your CPU to render, but it's going to be slower. Now you can also make sure you go to Sampling, Viewport Denoising. You can either have None or Optix accelerated. So if you've got a scene like this one, here I do have the Viewport Denoising on, and if we turn it off, you can see that if we start recalculating and re-rendering the scene by moving it in the viewport, it'll take a moment here, and whenever it comes in, you'll notice what that viewport denoising does. It's just a nicety. You don't really need to do it, but you can see it never quite clears up. It always looks pixelated. This is just how you're seeing it. This is not what your final render will look like, so again, it's just a nicety. Let's go back to our basic scene here. Now, whenever we are trying to speed up the computation rate of cycles to get a faster image that looks just as good as one that takes longer, you want to set up adaptive sampling. So all you do is just enable it here in the settings. What this will do is it will say this is a scene. It will look at the different render areas, render blocks, and if it determines it's an area with less reflections, light reflections, or anything like that that would cause noise, it doesn't need to do as many samples to get a clean render for there. So that's a way to reduce your render times while working with cycles. And film is a property in our scene settings that we will get to later, but I just want you to be aware that this is where you would find it in your render properties, excuse me. So once you've got all that, I would suggest you go to File, Defaults, and Save Startup File. What this will do is make sure that every time you open up an instance of Blender, all of these things that you've set up in your render properties are there again. So you don't have to keep redoing it every time and maybe change this or that. So I would highly recommend saving a default file that has all of those set up. So I think that is it for just the housekeeping part. Next, what we're going to get into is basic materials, and then from there we'll do lighting and actual rendering. Alright, so basic materials, and basic's really the name of the game whenever you're trying to set up a render for a 28 to 40 millimeter 3D printable miniature, because you're not really trying to obfuscate the details of the miniature itself or of your model itself with overly complex textures. So for example, if you've got cloth, you don't really need to spend the time setting up a normal map and a bump map for a cloth texture to give it a roughness. You can really just get away with a color and playing with some of the default values of a principal BDSF shader. Now, here in this scene, I think there's about 3 basic different types of materials. There's just the normal one, which would be the colors. So for the Red Ranger here, he has got his red armor set up. And as you can see, this is just a pretty standard, generic BDSF shader that comes out of Blender whenever you create a new material. So the main thing is you want to make sure you go through and you assign materials to each object. Now for this scene, since it was made as a joke scene, I went ahead and merged a lot of different objects that I wouldn't normally. Like I would leave the forearm separate from the upper arm, and I would leave the torso as a piece and keep the head as a separate piece, but since I was just kind of copying it from one model I made to this scene to make this picture, I just joined them for ease. But here you can see the body has a bunch of different materials set up. It's got the red armor, the white highlighted areas, everything that's black like the face guard. The gems are a little bit different. I have set those up as glass BDSF shaders. BSDF, excuse me. Freudian slip. So I've set those up as glass, so you get a little bit of reflection, and depending on where it is in the scene, like right here, you can see a little bit through it, and you can see the color underneath reflecting in, or you can see the light coming, or like right here where the light's not directly on it, you can see that it's pretty dark. So all the gems are set up as glass materials. They all are the same, except for some reason, where is it? Yeah, they're all the same. So one thing, if you take a look here, if you're wanting to get a plastic-like material, you really want to play with the specular and roughness. So right now, roughness is about half. What does that mean? Well, that means how much light from your scene gets reflected off the object, obviously. So if we turn this way down to 0, you can see that the face guard has this little bit of highlight. That wasn't there before. There we go. You can kind of see that a little bit of the pink ranger right here is reflecting right there on the face guard. And you've got a little bit of white streak there. If you turn this roughness all the way up, though, the opposite's going to happen, and it's going to be completely matte. So another thing, setting up your metallics. Again, just simple materials for these models because they're not supposed to be overly complex, and you're not trying to drown out the details of your model with details of a texture that will not show up in a print. So for here, I just went ahead and gave it a gold-ish color. I set the metallic way up. I brought the roughness way down, and that's how we get this highly reflective material here. In fact, if you look right here, well, if I can zoom in on it properly. Yeah, if you look right here at this golden area, this golden ball, you can kind of see what looks like a workshop reflected in there. And that's how we've got our lighting set up. I'll come back to that here in a moment. But, you know, for the sword, again, just a gray color, metallic. This one I give a little bit of specular too, so it looks a little bit rougher because it's a sword, you know, it's been in battle. Roughness is a little bit higher for that reason as well. And then finally, the last one is old Elrond here. Eldrad here. So with Eldrad, I wanted him to be like Zordon. So this is just a cylinder object. Let's go back to object mode. Just a cylinder with a glass BSDF shader. And then for the little dais that it's on, there are two materials set up. Now I want to go ahead and show this to you. So if you go to edit mode, you can select different faces and assign different materials. So you see most of the object has this gold metallic kind of material assigned to it. However, if you want to say change this face to an emission shader, or you want to put another texture on it, what you would want to do is select that. If you haven't already, create a new material by adding a material slot, and then selecting the material that you want, either the new one you created or like this one, which is an emissive shader, and then you just assign that face. So if we go back to rendered view, you can see that this one is glowing, and whenever we put it in our scene, it will emit light that will reflect off the other objects in the scene. So one of the reasons why I suggested earlier to add the plugin images as planes is for Eldrad there. So whenever we go back to, it's a big scene so it takes a little bit to load. Whenever we go back to main view here, I'll show you what it is. So if we select him here and just hit the slash key on your keyboard, it will single an object out. All this is just a picture that I photoshopped to remove the background, give it a transparent background, and then if you go to File, Import, Images as Planes, if you go to Documents, make sure that you've got Use Alpha selected, and any object that you import, any alpha will be removed. So just like this, it looks like a floating head. And so all I did here was I added some ring cuts to create a flat face here, kind of where the nose is, pull it out a little bit to give that head a little bit of depth and dimension, and it will definitely show up in that glass tube. So if we go back to our scene here, we can see that his head is just kind of suspended in that glass just because that plane that image is on is floating in there. And then because we've got the emissive shader below in that little dais area, it's glowing up into that glass tube and reflections are bouncing off there. So again, with these kind of models, you're not trying to get super advanced with your texturing. Now you can do something like this that I did with the Incubi, and what I have done here is I've set up a little bit more of an advanced material because I wanted to do some edge wear, some kind of, you know, the paint is rubbing off or something like that. So if you go to your shading tab, in your material, what you can do is set up a geometry node, go into a color ramp, and the color ramp is where this edge is going to be defined. So pointiness is basically the edges of your object. And then that color is going to go to a mix shader, and then you've got a principal BSDF here with a diffuse and glossy going in. And that's just setting up the material to procedurally find edges and give them a different color. Now, if this band is a little bit too thick, you can duplicate this color ramp as so. Duplicate it like this, and you see that it has narrowed that band, and it's a little bit clearer. There's not that that gray that was there before. So if we just if you are new to nodes, if you select a node and then hit M, it mutes that node. So you can see the difference whenever we've got that second color ramp off versus on. Alright, so that's really it for materials. Next, we're going to go ahead and talk about scenes and lighting everything up. Alright, and finally it comes to lighting, one of the most important parts of rendering. So there are different things that you can do here. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and release this blend file whenever the video comes out, so you guys can see the different lighting setups that I've got here, and you can play around with them and try to find out what works for you. So the first one we're going to cover is a classic, just standard 3-point lighting. It's called that because there are 3 points of light. You've got your key light, which is going to be the main body, main focus of light. You've got your rim light, which is going to be slightly behind the object, because what you're trying to do with the rim light is capture just the edges of things, like the edge of the jaw, to give a little bit of depth to that main key light. And in photography, this is typically a reflective surface, like a silver screen or something, but this is your fill light, which is just going to be the bounce light to fill out the rest of the body. In fact, if we go to the rendering tab, we can see that I've already rendered out a few things here. So this is the final 3-point lighting setup. You can see that it does depth pretty well. We can show that this is a little bit further back on a different plane than right here. You can see the shadows in the armpit here. There's depth in the crotch. You can see that the main torso of the model is hollow, and there's a lot of dark areas in there. The chin or jaw here, you can see that there are little tendons coming out from the larynx that's exposed, showing different depth areas there. So this is just your standard lighting setup. It's really good if you want to get just depth and character of a model. Now, to show you what the different breakdown is, this is going to be your standard key light. So if you just have this light going on, you can see that there are details that are lost. Like right here, this leg's pretty much obstructed by shadows. Right here, the head, you can't really see what's going on. There's a little bit of depth here with the shading, but it's still lost a lot of detail. Like right in here is pretty much gone. Right here. And that's where your rim light will come in. So these are the things that your rim light will ideally capture, just the edges of an object. So here you can see that I've given it a different color, mostly just to differentiate it from the other two lights in the scene. So again, it's capturing really here the edges of like the hand, that forearm, the side of the skull, and the neck. And finally your bounce light or your fill light will get everything else. So this should be, again, if you're familiar with photography, it's going to be a reflective surface that reflects the key light back onto the object. So in this case, we've given it a little bit of a colder color, and you can see where the darkness is here. So it's once you get all three together, again, you go back to that first one, and you can really see the details very well, and the shadows look pretty good. But there are other things that we can do. So if we go back to our layout here, we're going to go ahead and hide the 3-point lighting. The next one I want to talk about is hard light. So if you are trying to get something dramatic or dynamic for your model, hard light is what you would really want. So all it is, really you can get away with just one light. I'll show you the render here in a minute with two. But you've just got a light here on the edge of the model, and you're just getting a stark light against different areas. So let's take a look here. So this is our example of hard light, and again, this one has two light sources in the scene. You can see that the hand is pretty much gone, whatever it's holding is gone. But if you're wanting a dramatic feeling for your render, this is the way to go. In fact, let's go ahead and do something where we select this light, and we're going to disable it in renders, and we're going to render again. So this is what our object will look like with just one light. A lot of it's just eaten up by shadows, but again, it looks very dramatic. And if that's something that you're wanting, hard light may be your option. I do want to talk about camera for a minute. So if you go ahead and select your camera and hit 0 on the numpad, it will take you to what the camera sees, and this is how you can control it. In fact, if you go here to the camera options, you can set the focal length here. So typically lower focal length will give you more depth, but if you go too far, you get kind of a fisheye view. If you go too close, it flattens out all the details and you can't really see depth in your photo as much. So I typically keep it around 25 millimeter. One other thing, in the camera, you don't have to do this in your camera, but typically where I have it set up at. So what you can do, let's go to rendered view real quick. Now you can see it renders the whole scene, but if you have a large scene, that can take a long time to do. And what if you just want to render, I don't know, a small area to see what it looks like with a material or lighting that you're setting up? What you can do is hit Control B. It will give you this box select option. So if you just drag and select, you will only render this area. And again, if you've got a large scene, this will be a lot quicker to give you a preview in your viewport. And you can hit Control Alt B to clear off your box render selection. And you can do it outside of your camera as well. One thing to note, whenever it's outside the camera, that box is kind of free floating. So if I zoom out or zoom in, the box doesn't zoom with the camera in the viewport, and it stays static. So let's go ahead and clear that out real quick. So those were the options for hard light and 3-point light. Let's take a look at another one. This one, the previous two, you could run in cycle or in Eevee. You could run inside the real-time rendering engine and get decent results because they use actual lights. These next two you cannot use. So first one is emissive. So what we've got here is just a plane, and if we go to shading and go to object, I can show you what the node setup for this object is. It's just a texture coordinate going to a mapping node with a color ramp, and then set up to an emission node. Now if you want just a flat color, you can disconnect it here and set up RGB to an emission node. But if you want to do, and I've got these colors here because 1, I like them, and 2, I like the contrast they show. But if you just want like a warm to a cold light, and what I mean by that, light is measured in degrees Kelvin. So the cooler a light source is, the more blue it's going to be, and the warmer it is, the more red it's going to be. So if you want to set up kind of a natural light, you can set up warmer going to a slightly colder tone here, and you'll get a gradient of color throughout this. So let's go to rendering and see what that rendered image would look like. Now you can see also I've put a object inside the chest and given it another emissive shader just to kind of create a glow there and to show depth there. But that's what this type of lighting setup would look like. So again, this would not work in Eevee. If you're trying to do emissive rendering or emissive lighting, you have to use cycles. That may change, or there may be like an edge case that I don't know about which would cause emissives to work, but as far as I know, it's cycles only. And this one is the next to last one, actually. So let's go ahead and hide this. We want to go to Studio Lights. And again, these are just set up as emissive panels. If we take a look at the materials, I've got kind of a cool, not really cool, but a neutral white here. That's kind of the fill light on this side. Above it, I've got a slightly cooler white. And then finally over here, I've got a warmer light. And this will create more of a, almost like a product render. So if you're trying to make something for a showcase catalog or something, and this is what that one would look like. And this one would really show just the natural color of the material that you've got on your object. So this one you can see a little bit of the specular highlighting that I've got, and specular highlighting is something that you would really want to look at if you're trying to make a realistic flesh tone. So that's in your material here. Let's go back here. So for the material, I've got it set up as a, where is it? Here we go. I've got it set up as a subsurface scattering surface. I've got the color of the skin, and then here I've got the inside. So what subsurface scattering is, if you ever take a flashlight and hold it up to your hand and you can kind of see through the thin areas, that's what we're replicating here. So I've given it kind of a pinker, like blood's flowing through kind of color. So those are the four main lighting setups that you can create. Now there is another one. This one I've been using more recently. It's called an HDRI. Now HDRIs you can get free at hdrihaven.com. You just go over here to HDRIs, it'll take you to this scene. What they are 360 degree photos of high dynamic range. And what I mean by that is they have taken multiple photos in the same area with different exposures to get brighter photos and darker photos, and they have basically merged them all together in one file. So what you can do is you can get realistic lighting from an actual place and put it in your scene and get natural lighting. So let's go back to Blender. To set this up, we're going to go to the Shading tab, make sure we are in World. We're going to add a texture coordinate, and I'll show you why here in a bit. And then we're going to add an environmental texture. Once you're in environmental texture, you're going to open up and find the HDRI image that you've got, and you're going to put it in the background of your scene. So now if we go to this tab here, whenever you're in the shading mode, make sure you've got your background strength set to 1, otherwise you won't see anything. My mistake. So let's go back to layout, and we've got rendering mode on, and you can see that this is the scene in which your HDRI was taken. So it was some dude's workshop apparently. But if you look at the model, you can see that we've captured lighting from the actual scene, and if we render that image, give it just a few moments here, it's going to look natural. It's going to look really good. So we can already see, yeah. So what about this background though? Like with an HDRI, you're also getting a photo of the environment that it was taken in, but what if you don't want that? Well, there's a handy little trick you can do. Let's go ahead and close this. If you go to your render settings again, go back to film, which I mentioned earlier, and click transparent. If you've also got a scene with glass, you can make sure you click transparent glass to get actually transparent glass, like I did with the Eldrad Zordon earlier. And now you can see that the background is totally gone. And this is handy for a lot of different things. So if we just render this image again, it's going to put an alpha behind the object. So if you want to take your object or part of your scene and put it in Photoshop or something to get an effect kind of like this, where I took a 3D model and put it in a photo of a real world environment, you can do that quite easily. So that's how I did this. You put a texture coordinate in our world here, is what you can do, you can create a control object. So in this case it's going to be a generic empty. We're going to select the object here in the texture coordinate, make sure the object node is going to vector of your environment texture. And if you go to layout, let's turn off transparency real quick so we can see the background. If we grab a hold of this control object and just rotate it, you can see that we're actually rotating the HDRI, and we're getting different lighting based on how it's rotated. So you can see here we've positioned the light right behind the object. If we try to maneuver it forward a bit like that, we get a front on light view. So we're going to move it a little bit, try to move it off to the side. There we go. So that's something you can do to control the lighting of your HDRI. And you should be able to actually have an HDRI and emissive shader set up. So you can add, you can kind of mix and match the different options you've got here. I think that's everything I wanted to cover in this little video tips collection. If you guys have any questions, just hit me up on Discord. Yeah, happy rendering.